Hello and welcome to NewsClick. Today we have with us Vijay Prashad to discuss the developments taking place in Syria and Levant. Vijay, what is the latest situation in Syria, particularly considering there has been a huge internal displacement, there's a very large refugee outflow into Lebanon of the Syrians, and considering the kind of resources that they have access to, what's really happening to them?
The humanitarian situation inside Syria and outside Syria, with the Syrian refugees is abysmal. It's a almost unheard of thing for the UN agencies to produce multiple reports, within weeks of each other on the status of refugees in any country. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, there is also an enormous refugee problem, but you don't get reports coming every 2 weeks, reassessing the situation. Hundreds of thousands of people fleeing Syria, going to camps in Jordan, in northern Jordan, going to camps in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. Some have gone to camps in Turkey, but the bulk have come into Jordan and into Lebanon. Tragically, in the early weeks of January, there was a huge storm in the Mediterranean, in the eastern Mediterranean, snow in Jordan, lot of rain in Lebanon. Camps have been flooded out. So the major camps in northern Jordan were all underwater, mud and water. There are tragic stories of one Syrian person talking about how they lost a baby in a flood. Tragic stories, hundreds of thousands of people. World Food Program says they just don't have the ability to produce food supplies for the refugees. The UNHCR reports that inside, that is the refugee agency, inside Syria, people are using the UNHCR tarps, UN tarpaulins as a protection, for bombed out buildings while they stay in it. And people assume that places like Syria, it's warm all the time. I mean, they face a terrible winter, and the situation therefore is critical. UNICEF has released a report saying that they are within 90 days of a catastrophe inside Syria as far as Syrian children are concerned. So the humanitarian situation is just unbelievable. It's unfathomable. Syria, which at one point was quite a modern society, is already crumbled. At least in sections of Syria, have crumbled into a large refugee camp. And I think not enough is made of this major humanitarian crisis.
Also, the Palestinian refugee camp, which was overrun by some of the militant groups, led to a fight over there. Large-scale displacement from the refugee camp, again becoming refugees for the second time.
Yes, that's the Yarmouk camp. And the Yarmouk camp is the gateway to the Damascus airport. And so it's a significant place. It's not just the largest Palestinian refugee camp set up in the 1950s. It's not just the largest camp, it also has a strategic location to capture the airport. So when groups from the Free Syrian Army and others came into the camp, there's some disagreement about what happened around there. The upshot was, of course, the regime said that everybody must leave the camp. A text message was sent and there was a large-scale displacement from the camp. The problem is that when you have a situation where it's not clear what the politics are, how the politics are falling out, very large numbers of civilians, bewildered, terrified, flee. Now, what was interesting about Yarmouk is that yes, they fled, many went across into Lebanon, but a few days later, a very large section returned to Yarmouk. And the reason they returned is they explicitly said, we've already fled Palestine. We can't keep fleeing. This is exhausting. Plus, there was a fear, of course, that their own spaces were going to now be basically destroyed. There was whatever. So people returned to Yarmouk, but that didn't stop sections of the Palestinians from coming into Lebanon. Where as it is, Palestinians have a sort of second-class citizenship. So it's not the best place in the world to flee toward.
Do you find it ironic that Americans protested against Palestinians being attacked, bombed in the Yarmouk camp while they didn't seem to have any problems with happening in Gaza?
It's not ironic at all. I mean, this is just hypocritical. As far as the United States is concerned, anything Israel does is acceptable. Anything that they deem an enemy to do is unacceptable. I mean, the real irony here, of course, isn't that they had double standards on who's killing the Palestinians. The real irony is that the United States is not fully committed to the removal of Mr. Assad from power. You know, that the entire US policy over Syria is ironic. On the surface, they have been taking a very hard position against the Syrian regime. But all signs demonstrate that the United States here is in a bind in a way, because the Israelis do not want to see the precipitous departure of Mr. Assad. You know, if there is a so-called regime change in Syria, if it is likely there will be an Islamist government in Damascus, it will put a lot of pressure on Israel. As it is, they have a regime in Egypt which they find, you know, not easy to read. You know, it's clear that this is not like a national liberation regime. You know, the Morsi government, the Islamists in Egypt, they are not going to go and liberate the Sinai further, to liberate Gaza. They're not going to do anything like that. But it's a harder regime to read than Mubarak. You know, on this side you have Lebanon, which has never signed a peace agreement with Israel. If now in Syria as well you have a regime that's hard to read, Israel is going to be much more threatened, and Israel's asymmetrical defense posture is going to have to alter. You know, since the Camp David Accord of 1979, Israel had taken Egypt offline from its spheres. Israel had also taken Syria offline, even though they didn't sign a peace agreement. They went offline. Israel didn't have to bother too much about a Syrian attack. Then they could asymmetrically take care of Lebanon and the Palestinians. If you get this new environment, Israel does not want to see the threats intensify.
But nevertheless, the US allies, essentially in West Asia, which is Qatar and Saudi Arabia, are backing the rebels full hilt, and the Americans are providing arms and other equipment, money to these, and also shoring up their so-called legitimacy by talking about the Syrian coalition and so on.
Yeah, that is all true. I mean, look at it this way. Unlike Libya, where the stars favored a non-ironic foreign policy, if you let me put it like that, you know, where what they were saying in public is precisely what they wanted to see happen. You know, so there you had a very quick NATO intervention. In Syria, you are not going to see a NATO intervention. I mean, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, the Secretary General of NATO, has over the last year consistently said, we are not going to intervene militarily as NATO. Why? On the one side, the geopolitics is forbidding, okay, because of Israel, because they don't know exactly what would happen in Iraq, you know, which is another country that people often don't put into the equation. But secondly, unlike Libya, Syria has built up a formidable air defense system. You know, it's going to be much harder militarily, that is tactically, to deal with the Syrians. So NATO is said explicitly, we are not coming in. The Americans have done the next best thing, which is they are helping bleed Syria. I mean, if you can't overthrow the regime by force, you just bleed the country.
Do you think the destruction of Syria is really their military aim, so they knock Syria out of the reckoning, and the long-term civil war with millions of people killed, displaced, etc., is not something they're really bothered about?
No, nobody seems bothered about that. You know, neither the Assad regime, which has not been serious about seeking a political settlement. You know, every time Assad comes and talks about the nature of a political settlement, he's carbon copied his previous speech. I mean, his recent speech in early January is a similar speech he made over the summer. There's no new proposal there. So obviously the opposition, and I don't just mean the Qatari and Saudi-backed opposition, but the relatively independent opposition scoffs at this. You know, they're not interested in this. They want something further, some kind of guarantees, etc. Those have not been put on the table. The test of that is Brahmini, Lakhdar Brahmini, the UN envoy, who, you know, he's got a history of coming into difficult situations and being able to create a space for dialogue. After all, he was the guy who put together the space for the TAF Accords, which brought so-called peace to Lebanon in 1989. You know, Brahmini has thrown his hands in the air and said that nobody here is serious about peace. In other words, all the domestic actors, all the geopolitical actors seem resigned to this non-stop bloodletting in Syria. And I think that is the core of how this becomes such an intractable and difficult position.
Do you think that essentially that is in fact the US policy, that let Syria bleed, Iran then is on the tenterhooks, but let it not come that the Islamists seize power over there, which could then pose a different set of problems. Do you think that therefore the American policy is really this rather than anything else?
If I was to put maybe a test to establish that this was US policy, I think the best test was actually conducted by the Turks. You know, last year, I think it was in October, the Turks made hue and cry when a missile, a shell landed on Turkish soil, killed some Turkish civilians. By the way, this is not the first shell that's landed in Turkey from Syria. You know, this conflict has been going on for 2 years. Several shells have landed in Turkey, but they made this a big test. They threatened to mobilize military. They called on the NATO to defend them because after all they are a NATO state. At that point, you saw what the Americans and the Europeans did. Essentially, they told the Turks, look, you know, we know you felt out on a limb because Turkey under Erdogan took the most advanced policy very quickly, you know, that Assad has to go. They backed the opposition. They gave them camps, etc. But Turkey found that it was really alone out there. It was alone to the point where they had to essentially tell the Free Syrian Army, you've got to go back into Syria. You know, and the Free Syrian Army did that as a point of victory. We have now established in Syria. Actually, what happened was the Turks didn't want them anymore because they could not deal with the fact that the West wasn't going with them on the one side. Secondly, Assad did something rather clever. He took advantage of the Kurdish situation and told the Syrian Kurds and the Turkish Kurds, free, you know, you have an enclave in the north. The PKK can establish, any group can establish, and you go fight. And in fact, the PKK insurgency picks up again in eastern Turkey. He
pulled back his troops saying, I can't defend it anymore.
I can't defend it, so I'm busy here, etc. So the test was that Turkey tried to go and say, West, we need you. And all the West came back with what about 9 or 10 Patriot batteries, you know, which is a symbolic gesture. It's going to take several months to put together. It's nothing. And that is a test that the West actually may not have a direct military strategy to overthrow the Assad regime. What it's doing is it's arming these groups, you know, trying to influence the nature of the opposition, and they are relatively evenly matched with the Assad regime, and they are bleeding each other and bleeding the country to death.
Brings up the issue of Turkey. Turkey has recently talked also about the PKK and they want to open negotiations with them. At the same time, 3 leading PKK members in France have been killed. One of them, one of the founders of the PKK itself. Do you think this is just an illusion of peace while actually attacking the PKK, or do you think that this is something else?
Well, you know, the Turks immediately after the assassination of these 3, one very senior leader, founder of the PKK, most senior woman in the PKK, she was a commander in northern Iraq during the late 80s and into the 1990s, a very, you know, important person in the PKK's history. The 2 other people were much younger. They were definitely assassinated inside their Kurdish information center in Paris. You know, this occurs. The French say it's definitely an assassination. Now keep in mind that it's the French who a year and a half ago took a fight with Turkey over Armenia. You know, they made criticism of the Armenian, you know, the denial of the Armenian genocide, a crime inside France, which Turkey was very upset about. So they promised to prosecute this to the fullest. The Turkish government said it could be an internal feud in the PKK. This may not be anything other than that. Others in the PKK said, no, you have assassinated, that is sections, not of the government necessarily, but sections of the Turkish state or the paramilitary right-wing group called the Grey Wolves might have gone and assassinated these 3 women to derail the talks that have already been going on between the government of Mr. Erdogan and the imprisoned PKK leader Abdullah Öcalan. Now, you know, the Turkish, this shadowy state section in Turkey is to be taken seriously. You know, they have previously done things like this to derail talks. They want to have a kind of Sri Lankan solution, you know, where you, instead of negotiating with the Tamil Tigers, you crush them to the last person. That's what they want to do with the PKK. Unfortunately, it means exactly what happened in Sri Lanka, where you're not only going to crush the political movement, but you're going to have to really suppress the population. It's going to be very hard to do. You know, the casualty count in Sri Lanka is not known. I don't think people really know exactly what happened. Very poor investigation of what occurred. In Turkey, they've been trying exactly the same kind of thing. So, you know, the Erdogan government has wanted to put the PKK thing off the sites now, because they are, in a sense, or they have themselves you know, gone a little too far on the Syria matter. You know, the foreign minister of Turkey said that I'm going to create a neo-Ottoman foreign policy. Well, the Syrian crisis has made them back down from those ambitions, certainly. And I think a peace deal with the PKK would give them some breathing space.
In fact, it would also be very stupid in today's climate for Turkey to talk of a new Ottoman policy, given the fact that that meant actually colonizing the Arabs. So, in that sense, in today's terms, anybody talking of a new Ottoman policy would be rather undiplomatic, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the foreign minister has said it openly that it's kind of a new, you know, it's coming back to that kind of thing. What they also talk about, what this particular government is interested in, is they want to model what they consider moderate Islamism. You know, that's what Erdogan talked about when he went to Cairo, you know, in 2011. They want to put forward a vision. Yeah, it's interesting, when the Arab Spring broke out, several claimants to be the kind of heir or the antecedent of the Arab Spring appeared. One was the Turks, the other were the Iranians. The Iranians called this the Islamic awakening. You know, different people had, and the Americans, of course, showed up and said it's democracy, you know, and it's our gift to you. So, different people were trying to shape the nature of this Arab Spring. Obviously, it wasn't so easy to shape, because there are democratic forces that don't want to be tutored by Ankara, they don't want to be tutored by Tehran, they certainly don't want to be tutored by Washington DC. They have their own ideas. But Turkey certainly was burnt by Syria, and to me that is a precise test of the limits of how far American power, Western power, is willing to go directly, you know, to so-called come to the aid of the Syrian people. That is not on their agenda.
Thank you, Vijay. Let's keep watching Syria, because I don't think this is going to be resolved in the short term. Thank you very much.
Thank you.